Welcome to the Retreat Radio, where we go beyond temporary fixes and surface-level symptom management. Here, we dig into the real root causes behind your symptoms so that you can understand your body, advocate for your health, and ask the right questions. I'm Heather Witt, physician assistant and owner of the Retreat Wellness and Aesthetics. This podcast sits at the intersection of aesthetics, longevity, and functional medicine, and you'll get information without the sugarcoating, the trends, or the nonsense fluff. Let's get into it. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Retreat Radio. Today, we're going to be talking about one of the most common treatments in aesthetic medicine and one of the most misunderstood as well, and that is neurotoxins. So we have Botox, Dysport, Xeomin, Jeuveau, Daxxify, and now Letybo here in the US market. Everyone's heard of the names, everyone's heard different opinions, and really, honestly, in my opinion, there's a lot of bad information out there. So today, just like always on this podcast, we're going to break all of this down and we're going to leave out all the trends, all the fluff, and all the misinformation. So today, I want to talk about how neurotoxins actually work, the real differences between the different brands, what we are seeing clinically with the different brands, and the 5 biggest myths that patients and honestly sometimes providers still believe. Because as always, when you understand the science behind this, you can make better informed decisions for yourself or for your patients, and that's really the goal. So let's get right into it. So before we get started, I think it's important that we get the basics down first, and I think we need to discuss exactly how neurotoxins work. Neurotoxins are not fillers. They do not add volume to the face. They work on muscles. So dynamic muscles of the face, when you have movement, we can put neurotoxin into them to decrease that movement, to then decrease lines on the face. If you are doing neurotoxins correctly, you should not have a frozen face. The cliche on all the movies where somebody goes and gets a Botox treatment. Have you seen Christmas with the Cranks, I think it is, where Tim Allen goes and gets a spray tan and gets neurotoxin or Botox done, and he looks legit crazy? That is not how your neurotoxin treatment should be looking. Let's talk about how exactly neurotoxin does its job. So I'm going to really overly simplify this. Your brain sends a message to a nerve that then tells your muscle to contract. That nerve has to first release a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. And you can think of this kind of like a text message between the nerve and the muscle. So the nerve sends the signal to move. The muscle receives that signal and then it contracts. This is what happens every time you lift your arm, every time you frown, raise your eyebrows, any type of muscle movement that you make. So this is where neurotoxins are going to come in. So neurotoxins work at that junction. We call it the neuromuscular junction. So it's between the nerve and the muscle, hence neuromuscular. This is the communication point. And what happens is inside of that nerve ending, there's proteins that help release that neurotransmitter acetylcholine. And remember, acetylcholine is needed to deliver the message to that muscle. One of the biggest proteins is called SNAP25. And this matters because neurotoxins basically cut or cleave this SNAP25. And when SNAP25 gets cut, that nerve can't properly send that acetylcholine release across that neuromuscular junction. So now when the brain says move, that message or that text message cannot be delivered, and hence the muscle will not move. So the point of this long term is that if the muscle is not fully contracting, you're having less repetitive movement, which means you're going to have softer lines over time. You're going to prevent deeper wrinkles from forming, and you're going to have better control of overactive muscles. So again, I want to reiterate that the point of neurotoxins is not to make someone expressionless. If you are making someone expressionless, you are doing it wrong and you're not providing a good treatment. It's really about reducing overactive muscle movements while still preserving natural expressions. So the goal is that the patient can still have a natural expression in their face. They can still raise their brows. They can still frown. They can still smile. They are just having less etched lines when doing so. Okay, so now that we have the basics down, let's quickly go over kind of the major scientific differences between the different brands. All of the brands that we're going to be talking about today that we commonly use in aesthetic medicine are botulinum toxin type A. So there's different types, and all within this category, they have the same mechanism, the same target, and the same overall purpose. However, where they differ is in manufacturing, the protein load, the onset of action, the duration of the treatment benefits, the diffusion characteristics of the product, how we convert the units, and really most importantly to us is clinically, how do they differ? I want to make a quick side note here too, in case I accidentally do it in this podcast. Botox is a brand name. It is not the product category itself. This is very similar to the whole Kleenex thing. So Kleenex is a brand of facial tissue. However, it has claimed the market, and now we all refer to facial tissue as Kleenex. So the same thing has happened with Botox, probably because it's been around the longest, and I do it myself, even though I don't use Botox. I say, oh, you guys, it's time for my Botox treatment, or, oh, hey, Brittany, when are you due for your Botox treatment? And I get so mad at myself every time I do it because Botox is a brand, just like Dysport, Xeomin, Jeuveau, etc. It is not the product itself. The umbrella product is Neurotoxins. Enough on that. Let's jump into really the big difference between the different brands. So let's start with Botox. Botox is manufactured by a company called Allergan. It was first launched in 1989. And as I said, it's the household name. It's the Kleenex of neurotoxins. It's a very predictable product. Typically, you start to see onset of action at about 5 to 7 days after treatment and full results at 2 weeks. Manufacturer label says duration of treatment is about 3 to 4 months. I disagree. Clinically, I see about 2 to 2.5 months. And the standard glabellar dose, so frown line dose, is about 20 units. Clinically, this is the most popular. People compare it to everything. It's been around the longest. Again, people know the name. It's very reliable. It's very consistent. There's very little surprise when using it. It doesn't mean it's the best. We'll get into that. Next up is Dysport. Dysport was brought to market in 1991 in Europe and then in 2009 in the US. So quite a bit later than Botox. It often kicks in much faster than Botox. Usually patients see it at about 2 or 3 days. They start to see it working. It has a little bit of clinically a softer feel to it. Patients tend to feel like it's not so harsh as Botox. It's good for larger treatment areas like the forehead or crow's feet area where you want it to spread a little bit nicer. And a standard on label again says it lasts about 3 to 4 months. I typically see pretty much close to 4 months, sometimes 5 months in my patients. And standard glabellar dose or frown line dose is 50 to 60 units, depending on how, again, you're reconstituting it. So this is important because on-label reconstitution of Dysport gets you 2.5 units of Dysport per 1 unit of Botox. And I feel like when you reconstitute that way, your product behaves more like a Botox in terms of duration of treatment. A lot of other providers use another popular reconstitution method, which is 3 units per 1 unit of Botox unit. And so when I reconstitute this way, I get that longer duration that I generally see of about 4 to 5 months. Next up is Xeomin. Xeomin was brought to Europe in 2005 and to the US in 2010. It is called the naked toxin, and this is where their marketing claims came in. When they first launched, they called themselves the vegan neurotoxin, and this is how they hooked a lot of clean living people because they kind of manipulated the data to suggest that this is a cleaner toxin just because it doesn't involve the proteins attached to it, accessory proteins that other brands have. And the thought behind this is that it leads to potentially lower immunogenicity over time or basically becoming immune to the product. I haven't, done much research into if this claim is true or not, but I don't use the product anyways for other reasons. Standard glabellar dose is also 20 units. Duration is typically on label. Again, it says 3 to 4 months. Clinically behaves similar to Botox. I don't agree. We'll get into that later when we get into the myths. Next up is Jeuveau. Jeuveau came to the market in 2019. It was launched in the US. It did not go to the European market first. This is often marketed as the modern tox. I believe at one point it was called new tox, but I think there was like a whole lawsuit with that. Basically, I don't think this is that impressive of a product. It basically is an identical twin to Botox. So I'm not going to go too much into it. It's not that much dramatically different. There's nothing magic about it. Next came Daxxify. Daxxify is from a company called Revance, which was brought to the market in 2022. Now, interestingly, the fillers from Revance, RHA, they were initially in Europe and then they got approved here. However, Daxxify came straight to the US market. And the big marketing word that they used here was longer duration and peptides. So initially, their marketing focused around a 6-month tox duration and using a 40-unit glabellar dose. So it is double the dose of Botox. Clinically, though, when this came to market, everybody hopped on that. We were all excited about it. Patients were excited. Most of us did not see that duration. We started complaining about it. So recently, the company redid their whole marketing claims and now say that they don't really put a timeline on it, but that you will get a longer duration, 1 to 2 months longer than your normal neurotoxins. I think it behaves similarly to Dysport duration around that 4-month mark. And the additional peptide that they include in it is what they say is what gives it that extra duration. But to me, that marketing switch up has always been a little bit shady. And when you first come out with marketing and you say a product is going to last a certain amount of time, and this is what you saw in your clinical trials, and then we don't see that in office, and then you completely switch up your marketing, that makes me feel like you lied on your clinical trials. Now, I'm not calling the company out. I'm not saying that they lied on their clinical trials, but that just does not sit right with me. And so I have a problem standing behind a brand that would do something like that. And when we trialed it at our office, we gave it a chance. Our whole team had it done. We trialed it on a few patients. Some people got very similar results to Dysport. Some people got results more similar to Botox duration. So for us, it just wasn't worth the price difference in bringing it into our office. So we don't really use it anymore either. Now, lastly, the newest to the market is Letybo. This is a company called Jeuveau. And this originally was in the Korean market in 2016 under the name Botulax, and then it came to the US market as Letybo in 2024. This is the newest one. There's not a whole lot of data out there clinically yet on it because it was just brought out more recently. From what, I have heard from my colleagues in the industry, again, very similar to Botox. The standard glabellar dose is 20 units. Early reports are showing, again, that comparable efficacy to Botox. It's really too early for me to make any claims about it or to bring it into my office. This is something that I always stand behind when new products come out in the market. I am not the first person to run to it and bring it to my office because, as we saw with Daxxify, sometimes what the company is telling you the product is going to do, we don't actually see clinically. I like to give it time in the market to see how it truly behaves before I start repping it and talking it up to my patients and trusting it on my patients' faces. So I'm out on this one still, but I'll keep you guys up to date on it. But so far, it's not looking very exciting to me. So now that we have all of that out of the way, let's jump into the myths. So these are some of the most common things that I hear from new patients in my office or people out on the street. And, I got something to say about all of them. So let's jump right in. Myth number 1, Botox is the best because it's the original. And this is, in my opinion, if you know me or you're a patient of mine or you've been on my social media, you know that this is one of the biggest myths in my opinion. And you know that I pretty much hate Botox. People assume that because Botox has been around for the longest, because it's that household Kleenex name, that it must automatically be the best. And that could not be further from the truth. Just because it's the most famous, just because it has the most marketing dollars behind it does not mean it's the best clinically for our patients. Now, Botox definitely deserves credit for pioneering the market. It was the first one to come to the market. It dominated branding. Obviously, they did something right there. But from a clinical standpoint, I do not use Botox in my practice. And the reason is simple. I consistently see better duration and stronger performance with Dysport, a different neurotoxin, than I see with Botox. And I have worked with both for my entire career, and so I have merit to stand behind that. Okay, so let's explain why I think this. This is where it starts to get a little bit interesting. So all of these neurotoxins I said earlier work through the same pathway. They ultimately interfere with acetylcholine by cleaving or cutting SNAP25, but they're not identical products. And you may think, well, why if they're all the same thing? And one of the biggest things that comes down to, there are many other things involved in the process, but one of the biggest things that comes down to is the amount of active core toxin that is delivered in a standard dose of each product. So what I mean by that is that each product has a certain nanogram amount of neurotoxin protein in the product itself. So for example, Botox in a standard 20 unit glabellar dose has 0.18 nanograms of core toxin. Now, Dysport, my favorite, has in their 50 unit standard dose, which is equivalent to a 20 unit Botox dose. So we're talking equivalent doses here, has 0.27 nanograms. So it's almost double, not quite double, but it's almost double the amount. And so when you have more core toxin, you're going to have a stronger result, which is a longer lasting result. Interestingly, I want to point out why I, probably even more than Botox, why I dislike Xeomin so much is that for an equivalent 20 unit dose of Xeomin, there is 0.08 nanograms. Now remember, Botox had 0.18. So this is half the amount of Botox. And so this is why I always say that I don't necessarily think that Xeomin is a bad product. However, I think that Xeomin came to the market wrong. Unlike Daxxify, who were very open and honest about, hey, you need double the dose of Botox to basically get the results, Xeomin did not do that. And then they came out as a slightly lower priced product. However, if you do not double the dose of Xeomin, you are really not going to get a good duration because you just are not getting enough core toxin. When you double that dose of Xeomin, so instead of using 20 units, you use 40 units for that frown line complex, now you are getting 0.16 nanograms. So much closer to the 0.18 that's in Botox. And so that's great. But if you double the dose of Xeomin, you're using double the product. And if you now double the cost of this slightly cheaper neurotoxin, it now becomes the most expensive neurotoxin. Again, this is why, as I talked about in some of the other podcasts, why marketing can be such an annoying thing in this industry and really any industry. And you have to be really, really careful about what you take away from a marketing slogan or a marketing campaign. Daxxify, as I said, came straight out of the gate and said, hey, you need 40 units to get the equivalent of 20 units of Botox. And when you do that 40 units, you get 0.18 nanograms, exactly the same as Botox, which is why I think it behaves more similarly to Botox. And maybe that peptide that's in there does give you a little bit more duration. But again, if you decrease this down to a 20 unit dose, like we did with Xeomin, you're getting 0.09, very similar to Xeomin. Do you see how this amount of core toxin matters? Now, I know I just talked a whole lot of numbers and I talked a whole lot of nanograms and things like that, but hopefully you were able to follow along with that. I will post a little link at the bottom in the description of this for a little chart or a little table that will list each of those neurotoxins, their standard dose, and then the active core toxin in each one. And you could always go back and re-listen to that while looking at that because I think that that would be very, very helpful. Okay, now one quick caveat I want to make to that is this is what I see clinically and scientifically when we look at, again, that amount of core toxin per unit, it makes sense why Dysport is one of the best performing and longest lasting neurotoxins on the market. However, not everybody and everybody's anatomy and body responds the same. There are a few handful of patients that I do have that do react better to other neurotoxins than Dysport. Granted, it is very rare, but I do see it. And so I think that despite that, it still is important that you do give your patients that transparency that just because Botox is the oldest in the market does not mean it's automatically the best. just because it's become the household name, just because all the influencers are talking about it. And even me, I use the term Botox when I'm talking about other things. That does not mean that it is clinically the best for you for the best outcomes. And I'm going for the best outcomes for my patients because I want them to be happy. That's my work. That's my billboard. And I want them to come back year after year. Myth number 2 is baby Botox is more natural. There's nothing that I dislike more than when I hear somebody talk about baby Botox. And there's nothing that I dislike more than that when I hear a provider talking about it and promoting it on their website or their social media channel. Take the syringe away from that provider. All baby Botox means is that you're using fewer units and you're spreading it across the same treatment area. And here's the problem. You cannot partially turn a muscle off. The muscle is either on or off. That acetylcholine is either getting through or it's not getting through. And people like the idea of baby Botox because it's marketed that, oh, you're going to get a more natural treatment. You're not going to look so frozen. What actually controls how frozen you look is not some magical little baby Botox dose or some fancy marketed term like baby Botox. It's placement. It is where your provider is placing that neurotoxin that's going to determine how natural you look. It's how that injector is looking at your anatomy and what their injection skills are and playing around with the movement of the muscles that's going to determine how frozen or how natural you look. And really, honestly, you can look more unnatural by using too few units than using too many units. And why this is because let's take the frontalis, the forehead muscle. In order to properly treat the muscle, you need to treat the entire muscle. A common thing people see is a Spock. So when you raise up your brows, you get this like super high peak of your lateral part of your brow and you get all these lines above it. And why that happens is because your provider treated the center area of your forehead or skimped on units, and they did not treat the outer part of your forehead. And when that happens, you get compensation. What compensation means is that now when you raise up your eyebrows, you do not move in this part of your forehead. So this part of the muscle above your outer eyebrows that is still active overcompensates and very heavily pulls up on those brows. And hence you get this over exaggerated, fake, like terrifying look on Christmas with the Cranks. So by using the proper amount of units and spreading them properly and making sure we're treating the entire muscle, you're actually going to get a more natural result. And then your results are going to last longer. Because that is the other thing about underdosing or using a baby Botox dose is you may get a great result if you're lucky, but that result is not going to last very long. And so you're going to spend more money over time. So not only are providers who are doing or promoting baby Botox, in my opinion, just not educated on the product, but also they are squeezing more money out of you in the long term, and they are risking you becoming immune to the product over the long term as well, which we'll talk about in another myth. Now, also down below, I'm going to link a journal study that talks about neutralizing antibodies, which is what makes people become immune to the products. A while back, I actually did a roundtable dinner with some injector friends of mine who we basically read this journal article and then we all came together and we discussed it, and it was on neutralizing antibodies. And we didn't really get that far with it because what the paper was showing and what we see clinically were two very different things. But we do know that there are two different kinds of mechanisms. Underdosing and significantly overdosing can both lead to the formation of these neutralizing antibodies, which all that basically means in layman's terms is that the product stops working for you. So you go in, you get your normal dose, and it either doesn't work at all or it wears off extremely quickly. And I don't know about you, but that sounds absolutely terrifying to me, and I do not want that to happen. So I'll link that paper below so you can take a look at it. Myth number 3, if you start tox, you can't stop because you'll look worse after. This is so false. You absolutely can stop. Your face does not suddenly just become worse because you've been using a neurotoxin. And if you really think about it, if you've been using a neurotoxin for 10 years and then suddenly you decide to stop, you still have aged 10 years. And if you've done nothing else to take care of your skin, of course you look older because you are older. And so patients sometimes think, well, I stopped tox and now I look worse. So how do you explain that? Well, no, you're comparing yourself to a smoother, more relaxed version that you've been used to seeing in the mirror for the past 5, 10 years. And now you're actually back at your baseline. And so, yeah, you look worse than you did last year because now you don't have any neurotoxin in your face. So how this works is that when you stop the neurotoxin, your muscles just go back to normal movement. And honestly, you usually return to actually looking better than you did at your baseline because over time you've spent years repetitively reducing the movement of your muscles. So that is going to give you a little bit of an anti-aging benefit. However, when your muscles are fully relaxed and you're able to form lines because you've lost collagen in your skin, you are going to look worse than when you had neurotoxin treatments. So correlation does not equal causation. Just because you looked good on Botox and then you stopped does not mean that the Botox caused you to look bad when you stopped. Myth number 4. I hear this one constantly and I hear it said to me all the time. You don't need Botox. You're too young. So usually somebody in their 20s or 30s starts talking about, hey, I'm thinking about getting some neurotoxin done. And people look at them and say, why are you going to get Botox? You don't even have wrinkles yet. You don't need that. You're young. You're beautiful. And honestly, that is the point of doing a neurotoxin. They're not just corrective. They are preventative. Your wrinkles don't just suddenly poof appear once you turn 40 or 45. They gradually form over years and years of these repetitive muscle movements of our face. Every time you raise up your eyebrows, every time you frown, every time you squint or clench your jaw, the skin is folding in that exact same place. And as you age and lose more and more collagen in the skin, that folds more and more and more, and it gets deeper and deeper. So when you're younger, you get an easier bounce back from this because you have more collagen, you have more elastin in your skin is stronger. However, over time of repeatedly doing that, and as you lose that collagen in your skin, those lines become deeper and more etched. So if you start neurotoxin earlier and you prevent those repetitive movements, you can prevent those lines from getting deeper and more etched to begin with. Hence, you have more natural aging, and it usually then requires less treatment of other things later in life. So when people say you don't need toxin because you already look young, sometimes the reason that they still look young is because they started early enough and they've been doing neurotoxin from the beginning. Like myself. People tell me all the time, oh my gosh, you're still in your early 30s, you don't need neurotoxin. I'm like, girl, I'm 38. I'm almost 39. I look like this because I have been doing this stuff since my mid-20s. That does not mean that every single 22-year-old out there needs a full face of tox. Absolutely not. That's where good assessment's going to come in, and that's where patient-specific dosing is going to be important. But preventative medicine is normal everywhere else. We don't wait for cavities to form and then start brushing our teeth. We brush our teeth to prevent the cavity from forming in the first place. Aesthetic medicine is no different. The goal is not to look frozen at 25. The goal is to look youthful and natural and to age more gracefully over time by reducing those repetitive movements and reducing the stress on the folds of the skin so they don't become more permanently etched over time. Very simple. And lastly, myth number 5. This is kind of a two-parter, but people come in and they say, oh, my neurotoxin lasts 8 or 9 months. I don't need to do it every 3 or 4 months. And this is a very, very common misconception because patients don't understand when you are supposed to be retreating. When they come in and they say, oh, see, it's been 8 months and I have movement now, so now I'm ready to treat. See how long it lasted? What they actually mean is that's finally when they feel like they return to their baseline and their lines are all over their face and they can't stand it anymore. So the way that a neurotoxin works is that it is usually the strongest action on your muscle between about 2 weeks until about 3 to 4 months and within that window, depending on the brand of toxin that you're using. After that, it's not like you all of a sudden bam, you go back to baseline and your wrinkles just pop back up overnight. Your movement gradually returns slowly and slowly after that point. And the problem with that is that patients don't really notice that early return of their movement because it happens so incredibly slowly. You can compare that to your hair growing. You don't really notice how long your hair is getting because it happens such a minute amount each day. So by the time that they're coming back into your office around 6 months, 7 months, 8 months, the muscles have returned to their full strength and they've been there for quite some time. And this matters because muscles adapt. And this is why we like consistent treatments every 3 to 4 months, depending on the brand you're using, because it can weaken and stop creating such aggressive folds of the skin. And why, in the long term, over the long run, even at your baseline, you have a softer baseline over time because you have consistently kept that muscle at bay and have not allowed it to return to full strength. But if you repeatedly wait for it to return to full strength and regaining all of that before you retreat again, you lose that consistency. The muscle has time now to retrain itself back to its original state to be repetitive and to be strong, which is going to work harder on those lines. You can kind of compare this to like physical therapy, but in reverse. So you're allowing that movement pattern to fully reestablish itself before interrupting it again. And you're not going to get that consistency. This is why most experienced injectors prefer maintenance treatments before you return to your complete baseline and not waiting until your lines fully come back. Usually around that 50% mark, which for Dysport, which is what I use, usually falls right about around 4 months, sometimes 5 months. So this ties in really nicely with another misconception that I hear a lot, which is, well, they come back, let's say at their 4 months, like I suggest, and they say, well, my lines aren't as bad. So can't we like come down in the dose? Can I use fewer units? Not necessarily. Your lines are softer, yes, because the treatment plan we're doing is working. Your muscles are consistently being controlled. You are having less repetitive movement and you're folding the skin in that area less and less over time. So if we suddenly all of a sudden give you a treatment and underdose you and do less units, your muscle is going to regain that stronger movement at a much faster rate. And those repetitive folding motions can start reestablishing themselves again. So this is especially important in super strong muscles like the glabella or the forehead and specifically the masseters. This is not to say, though, that over time dosage can't change. It absolutely can, because if I'm seeing a patient over a span of 10 years, again, they are aging over those 10 years. So anatomy can change. The dynamics of the face can change. The muscle activity can change. And so this is why dosing should always be individualized and you should always be readdressing it every time the patient comes in. But typically, for the most part, the dosage will stay around the same amount for the duration of their treatments. All right, so that's all the myths. And one thing I want you guys to take away from this, besides the myths, obviously, is that brand and marketing is not everything. And I will say that again and again and again until I'm blue in the face for pretty much everything I'm going to talk about on this podcast, because what matters most in this industry is your provider. Always, always first and foremost. I would always choose an excellent provider over any major toxin brand than using the trendiest one, but having a mediocre injector. Every single time, assessment matters. Facial balance matters. Understanding muscle pull patterns matters. Knowing when to say no matters, because it's not just about the toxin. It's about where you're placing it, how you're reconstituting that product, and your level of understanding of the musculature and how the muscles of the face work together. And this comes from a great provider who has years of education, who keeps up on their education throughout time. Your neurotoxin treatments, just like any other treatment in aesthetics, is about anatomy. It should not be a menu item. So if you are getting a cookie cutter dose or a cookie cutter treatment that is exactly the same as your friend and the next patient down the block, this should be concerning to you. And you should start getting a second opinion and shopping elsewhere, because the best injectors, they're not selling units, they're not selling syringes, they're not selling laser treatments. They're selling you a treatment plan for an outcome. And this is really, really important when we talk about neurotoxins, because a lot of people think that anybody can do it, that it's an easy cookie cutter thing. You can just study how many units you need in each area and you're going to get a good result. And the result will be different on every single patient. If you found this podcast helpful and you know someone who still thinks that, oh, well, if you get Botox, you're going to look frozen and you're going to look crazy, or you need help convincing your husband that this is going to be a good thing for you, then make sure you tell them all about this episode. Thank you so much for being here with me today, and I will see you next time on The Retreat Radio. The information shared on this podcast is for educational purposes only. It reflects clinical experience and opinion and is not intended to serve as a diagnosis, treatment plan, or medical advice. As always, please consult with a qualified healthcare provider before making any changes to your health, medications, or treatment plan. If you want to be a part of our community, make sure to follow us on Instagram at theretreat.wellness and theretreat.aesthetics. Thank you so much for spending part of your day with me today, and until next time.